I'm going to try and make this really brief and hopefully pretty open-ended, so that if any of you, we do have a few minutes available to us, so if you've got questions or comments or want to engage in a little bit of dialogue among yourselves and with us on some of these issues, if something strikes a chord, jump in with a question or comment. I've made this a lot briefer than I have in the past because, for one thing, I think I've discovered that lengthy reports that I've given in the past have tended to bore people silly, and probably not a good idea to do. So I've tried to pick the things that a lot of issues cross our plates in the office in a given year, or even in a given week, frankly. But a few always seem to rise to the top as chronic ongoing concerns, and as a small organization, although we try to deal with everything, we also try to use our limited resources on the things that are obviously of most concern to the industry, and so I've tried to highlight those. One that certainly tops my personal list are issues around people trying to cross the Canadian border into Canada, U.S. residents. This issue has typically been more visible and a greater irritant in northwestern Ontario than in the northeast, but it's visible everywhere, and I can tell you from talking to my colleagues in the Canadian Federation of Outfitter Associations that this is an issue that exists across the country. So it's not unique to northwestern Ontario, although it seemed to appear earliest there and be most chronic. It is about a recent being over the last 10 years, rather strict application at many border crossings of the Immigration Act that says someone who has a criminal record is not admissible to Canada, and an old impaired driving record counts as a criminal record. As it so happens, that's one of those offenses that thankfully changed dramatically in its in public attitudes and social status, so that we now take impaired driving pretty seriously. Unfortunately, in the past we did not. The upshot of that is, I am told that, and I don't want to single out a single state, but it's the one for which I have been given the stats. In the state of Minnesota, from which many northwestern Ontario guests come, approximately 1 person in 5 has an impaired driving conviction somewhere on their record. That may be a cultural artifact of Minnesota, or it may be the fact that they very abruptly got very serious about prosecuting impaired driving, but needless to say, that's created dramatic problems at the border. We can't change the Immigration Act over the short term, although we and our colleagues in the Canadian Federation of Outfitter Associations have asked that the politicians look hard at whether some more flexibility can be built into the application. So we have concentrated very hard in recent years on trying to help individual guests see what we could do to save a trip that meant saving a client for you as outfitters. We have very aggressively promoted the idea that outfitters should be sure to educate their guests and flag the fact that this could be a possible issue, and that if guests have questions or want more detailed information, to call the NOTO office directly. The upshot of that has been, by the way, during the peak part of our season, which was roughly began in February and kind of tapered off a little bit at your mid-season around July, I was averaging 3 to 4 phone calls a day from guests with questions about crossing the border. The good news is, I would say that I was probably able to offer advice that could potentially save an otherwise in-question trip in 90% plus of the cases. Yes, there were some people who had very recent convictions who were not going to be admissible, but any folks who had convictions that were over 5 years old, there were procedures in place. I was able to walk them through what procedures could be used. Admittedly, not a perfect fix. I'm sure we only helped a tiny fraction of the people who needed to be helped on that, but I hope it had a tiny and measurable impact on individual businesses' well-being in terms of getting some folks through. As I alluded to earlier, we're an active participant in the Canadian Federation of Outfitter Associations, a relatively new group. We've come together about 6 years ago, I guess. Our industry, the vast majority of lobbying issues we face are not federal issues, they're provincial issues, and so probably 90% of my time is spent on issues that fall within the province's jurisdiction. But the couple that fall within the federal jurisdiction tend to be very significant. One is the border crossing issue. It's federal jurisdiction, and an old adage among us association folks, lobbyist types, the level of government talks to the appropriate level of organization. And so for us as a provincial organization to go before federal politicians is a real challenge. They really want to talk to a national organization in the same way that our provincial politicians and bureaucrats will, seek us out and engage with us because we are the recognized provincial association. So being able to address these issues as a partner within CFOA has been very helpful, and we've had good engagement. My colleague from Manitoba, where the Justice Minister happens to reside, in fact my colleague from Manitoba resides in his riding, engages with him as on a constituency basis, has had good engagement on the border issue. Of course, the other federal issue that we're all very optimistic about is the now announced cancellation of the long gun registry, which will have a significant impact in terms of streamlining border crossing for guests who are coming to Canada hunting, we expect. And the other big issue that circles around the industry is the issue of the amendments to the Canada Shipping Act that were made some 10 odd years ago that potentially classifies some boats used in our industry as commercial passenger vessels rather than pleasure craft. The upshot being, if you pay the guy to drive it, he's now a ship's captain and it's a commercial vessel, and a whole different regulatory regime falls into place. We have made some limited progress in streamlining that regulation, but it's still very cumbersome because there are potentially special training requirements for the guy driving the boat, although in most cases in Ontario the pleasure craft operator card is accepted in place of other training, again thanks to aggressive lobbying by us and the CFOA. The other requirement that's kicking into place though is for the carriage of small vessel life jackets rather than PFDs, which will have a significant impact on the industry. We're still working very aggressively on that one. We discussed it at considerable length and met with two different officials from Transport Canada a week ago in Ottawa when the CFOA met. The Canadian Marine Advisory Council is meeting a week from today in Ottawa, which is where major policy initiatives are discussed in a public forum, and CFOA will be at the CMAC to speak on behalf of why those regulations need to be amended for the benefit of our interest and for our industry and frankly for guest safety. I will be appearing as the representative of CFOA to make our case to Transport Canada.